This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. We're doing top tips for responding to disclosures this morning. We've got a nice little group. I think we've got 11 people logged on. So please speak up, get involved. This is going to be a tough session. It's not something that, is comfortable to talk about. So I hope that everybody feels free to talk about it online today. And as you hopefully know, we've now got these up on our website as well. So if anybody wants to go back and look at it afterwards, you can do so. And if anybody wants me to send them the slideshow, I can also do that for you. Thanks, Danielle. I'll hand over to you.
No worries, thank you. Yeah, it is a tough discussion today. I have muted everyone again, but please do feel free to either use the chat panel below to let us know if there's any questions, and or unmute yourself and ask a question. And I'll let you know before I click the unmute button, just so you can prepare yourself if you've got some noise in the background. So today, when we talk about responding to disclosures, we're going to be talking about a few different things. So what are disclosures? When do they happen? And then we're going to look at two parts. First of all, handling emotion, so your emotion and the child's emotion, and then also legal responsibilities around that as well. Okay, so actually, before I move on, I should actually tell you what some of those things are. So a disclosure is when a child tells you about something that has happened to them that is not okay or is illegal and fits within the context of the legislation. We're going to move on to talk a little bit more about that this morning, but there's probably an interesting part about for you as carers and for all of you either caring for or working with children about when disclosures occur. And disclosures are kind of spontaneous. And I think I like this little picture of the penguins because it's just, in the midst of doing something, then that's when the disclosure occurs. So when you are probably the most busy is when the information comes out. Now, the information can come out not as a nice, clear, succinct story, but usually little bits of information. And kids, when they do that, when they give you a disclosure, they give you little bits of information to kind of test you about how you're going to respond to that. So when we have, when something happens to children, and when something happens to all of us, we kind of view that experience through the eyes that we have at the time. So for children, when something happens to them when they're very little, they view it through the eyes that they have at that time, and then they hold what could be irrational belief with that experience for the period of time. It's not until, and apparently the average age, according to research for disclosure, is 40. So got a long time to wait for these kids. And usually when they've got that disclosure or the experience of something that's happened to them, they're holding on to that with the irrational belief that they formed when they were very little. So if their abuser told them that it was their fault or because they were bad or something like that, they're holding not only the experience but also the irrational belief, holding that together. So when they're giving you the bit of information, they want to give it to you, but they're also holding this irrational belief with it. And that can prevent them from giving you everything in a nice, neat little bundle. So when they do give you information, it's usually just little snippets here and there, and usually when you're busy, because they want to test. They want to test if it's safe to say what has happened. So it could sound a bit mixed up. It could be just part of a bigger situation, or it could be something that sounds quite odd or different, and also their vocabulary. So they can only disclose with the vocabulary that they have at the time. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through. So it's being aware that the disclosure is going to come when your hands are full of washing, or when you're in the midst of cooking, or when you're doing something. And sometimes driving, when there's no eye contact. Kids, when they're telling you something difficult, they don't want to make eye contact, because eye contact is difficult at the best of times, leave alone when they're talking about something challenging. Okay, so I've got just a couple of slides that are about recognising what abuse and neglect is, and some of those signs, just so we kind of do a bit of an overview of that first before moving into talking about disclosures. So signs of abuse and neglect, and you would have all seen these having children in care, because every child that enters care does not come in unscathed. So distrust or wariness of adults, challenging behaviours, and we've talked about aggression, anxiousness, distress, withdrawing, all of those things, either the externalising behaviour or the internalising behaviour. Low self-esteem, being overly obedient and trying hard to please, and that internalising behaviour. Things like rocking, humming, sucking or biting, bedwetting, appearing accident prone, having unexplained bruises or injuries, alcohol or drug use, suicidal tendencies, not wanting to go home or not wanting to go to a certain place. That might be the bathroom. The bathroom's a pretty common one. Creating art or stories about abuse or graphic art, inappropriate sexual knowledge or behaviours for the age or development of the child. Malnutrition, frequent hunger, stealing or hoarding food, and we do have a webinar about hoarding food coming up. Poor hygiene, frequent absences from school, inappropriate clothing. Now that inappropriate clothing, it might be inappropriate in terms of our different definitions of fashion, but it also may be inappropriate clothing for the weather. So early brainstem impacts is about the temperature thermometer that we have, and if we don't have, if that early brainstem development is impacted, then children can have difficulty regulating their body temperature, so they may appear, they may not recognise that they feel cold and are still dressed, you know, as my grandmother would have said, for the last rose of summer in winter. Comments that no one is home, or that they're doing things alone. Having a lack of supervision for long periods, frequent illnesses, injuries, severe nappy rash that does not appear addressed. You know, kids get nappy rash all the time, but when it's not addressed or not addressed appropriately, it can really be prolonged. And children not meeting their developmental milestones without some kind of organic cause. So I'm sure for all of you, whether working with or caring for children, have seen these kinds of signs already, because you're at the end where children have already experienced these things. Okay, so I think these three messages are the most important kind of words to remember when children disclose. So first of all, to listen, second of all, to reassure, and the third one, to respect. So when we're listening, just being able to drop what we're doing and sit somewhere or sit in a quiet place side by side is much easier, because the child doesn't have to look at you. Now, also remember from the last few weeks while we've been on webinar and talking about brain development, that micro expression that comes across our face instantaneously is read immediately by the amygdala, and a fear response is alerted. So if you can sit next to the child and both be looking in the same direction rather than each other, and even just nodding or using a body posture that feels like you're listening and feels like you're present next to them, is going to be the first kind of key. Being calm and patient and allowing just for the child to be heard, let them use their own words, and we're going to talk a little bit more about leading questions a bit later, but avoid asking really any questions, and we're going to talk about what's appropriate questions and what's not appropriate questions, but it is best not to actually ask anything. Just listen, just be patient, just sit, and basically just being present and sitting with a child while they talk, and just slow head nodding and and things like that, where you are engaged with them but not actually saying anything, is going to be the most helpful way of responding. We need to reassure that the child's okay, and it's okay that they have told you about what has happened, and to address any concerns about the child's safety. So, for example, and we'll cover this more later in the week on Friday when we talk about reportable conduct, but if you're a respite carer and the child has made a disclosure about the care arrangement that they're in, or vice versa, or something like that, then having that conversation really quickly with the caseworker to be able to get some things in place to ensure the child's safe, and reassuring that the child's not at fault and not the cause of any kind of distress. And I've got some few lovely statements that will be good for you to use. Respect. We need to respect that the child may only reveal some of the details, and we need to acknowledge that they're brave. They're brave for saying anything at all. We need to also make sure that we don't make any promises to them, particularly ones that we can't keep. So I guess the big one for that would be, I won't tell anyone, because we actually have to tell quite a few people, and that's important. So we'll look through how we can best do that as we move through. And explaining to them, you're going to have to explain to them that in order to keep them safe, you do actually have to tell other people to make sure that they are safe. So when a child has disclosed something, it's really challenging and overwhelming, and it can be difficult to know how to respond. But these particular statements, they're from the Kids Helpline, and they're all statements that are really useful for children to hear. So feeling believed, you don't necessarily, it's about that they need to be able to feel like you believe them and you're on your side. Saying, I'm glad you told me, whilst probably none of us are glad to hear that information, just saying to them that you're glad that they told you. And I guess, in terms of what this means for children, is that they generally start to disclose when they feel safe. So when they feel safe and when they feel settled is generally when they start to disclose to you. So it's kind of like a little compliment in disguise, really, isn't it? They're all safe and settled in your home. Things are going well. This is when they feel like they can say something. The other time when they start to disclose is when they feel safe with you, but they're worried about going back. So if there's threats of going back into a situation where there's worry or something might happen, then that's another time when they're going to disclose. Telling them that it's not their fault. So again, children form when they reflect back on their time of their experience, and it could have been some time ago. They've got their irrational belief that goes with that. And so particularly children who've experienced physical abuse, then they may believe that what's happened is a consequence of their behaviour, or that they've been bad, or something that they've done. So just letting them know that it's not their fault is okay, or that they're not to blame. And whilst you need to be telling people about what is going on, being able to let them know that even though you need to tell somebody that, and they may need to talk to other people, and we'll talk more about that soon, that they're not alone and that you will help them and that you can be there with them as much as possible. That they're brave for telling you. Now, this next one, what happened is not okay. So this is the one that I conclude every interview I do with a child who makes a disclosure. And I guess my background has been in investigation, and I've spoken to a lot of children who have made disclosures about what their experiences are. And my kind of closing statement, I guess, to children is to thank them for telling me what they told me and to let them know what they told me that has happened to them is not okay. And I always add into the top of that, what they told me has happened to them is not okay. And it's about reassuring, because I guess, if we're interviewing, from my perspective, I guess in terms of that worker perspective, if we're interviewing them, they tell us everything that's happened to them, and we've gone through it in fine detail and all of that, and then I get to the end and just nod and smile and I go, okay, well, you might be able to call me or whatever. That can be really hard for a child, and they need to know that whatever has happened to them, whatever they've told me has happened, is not okay. And it's okay to say, I want to help you feel safe. Being a carer, hearing what the child has experienced, it's okay to say, I want to help you feel safe. So whilst we have these statements that are fantastic for the things that we can say, there's a lot of things that we can't say. And I think it's really important to know that we can't ask any children any leading questions. And so when I say being present and just sitting and nodding and sitting next to, so there's not any difficulty in eye contact, just nodding and giving, a light smile and just listening is the best way to hear the information. We can't ask any leading questions, and it's really important that we don't ask questions. If you're not trained to ask questions in this particular area, it's best not to ask any questions at all, but just give those statements, the reassuring kind of backup statements. If we asked a leading question, for example, were you in your bed, or were you in the backyard when that happened, it actually changes the way the child is encoded the memory in their mind. So when we experience really distressing things, so any kind of amounts of trauma, we code it in our brain, and it goes into our hippocampus, and our hippocampus holds onto that. And you'll notice that anything that you experience that has any kind of level of trauma resulted, you can probably recall that in kind of a video image of what's happened. It's like you can recall a mini movie of everything that has happened. When a child makes disclosure, they tell you a little bit about that mini movie. If you go back and ask questions, particularly were you, or were they, or asking about the perpetrator and what they were doing, or any particular questions at all, it actually changes the way the movie rolls. So when we pull a memory out of our brain, it's reconstructed at that point of time in that mini movie. If you then come in and start just willy-nilly asking questions and jumping from beginning to end and all over that, it changes the way that the memory is structured. And then when it comes for this child to be interviewed, so by the JCPR unit or by a caseworker, it actually changes the way that their incident of abuse can be recalled. So if they use a particular person's name, if they say Uncle Pete did whatever, and you don't know if they've got an Uncle Pete, it's okay. You don't need to ask. If they tell you, then that's okay. But you just need to write down Uncle Pete. If you were to change that to Uncle Peter, that might actually be somebody that's related. It might not be Uncle Pete that's the man next door and they called him Uncle Pete because that was an affectionate term or something like that. So we always need to be really careful that we don't actually change anything that the child has said or make any assumptions about that. You know, as children, we've got lots of different names for lots of different people that are not their full names. And some people go by their middle name instead of their first name. And there's lots of different complicated things around that. It's not your job to figure out who. And you don't need to worry about who. You just need to listen to what they've said. So asking any leading questions or asking more information about what's happened actually impacts not only the memory and the memory recall, but it impacts the quality of evidence as well. So when this child is interviewed in the future, and they, at the end of the interview, the investigator will ask them, have you told anybody? They have to say who they've told and what did you tell them? They need to say what they told you. And when they do that, it's about checking the quality of evidence. If it's getting to the point of investigation and this child's recited the story 5 times to 5 different people and they've been asked questions, then that evidence has limited quality. So it can't really be used for criminal charges. So the most important kind of key message is to not ask any questions, but just be supportive and say that you will help and you will be there and you'll try your best to keep them safe and what's happened is not okay. We also want to make sure that we don't repeat anything. So we don't want to say, oh, actually, did I get that right? And say what they said. Because again, it impacts that recall of the memory. We may accidentally change someone's name. And, you know, all of those things have really big consequences. The other thing that we tend to change without even thinking about it or to ask questions about is body parts. So we all know children that call body parts different things. And there's lots of different names for body parts. And we have to be really careful that we don't assume which body part they're talking about when they say a particular body part. So often small children, small girls can say in my bottom, but they don't have a differentiation between the front bottom and the back bottom at that particular age, particularly if they're still in nappies, because we say, oh, we're going to change your bottom, and it's all the one thing at that age. So we need to be really careful. We don't repeat back to them what they've said because we don't want to change their recall of the memory. And we also don't replace any of the words that they've used, that we just go quote unquote exactly what was said. We also need to be clear that we don't confront anybody. So if they made the disclosure about mum or dad, or they made the disclosure about the next door neighbour, or they made the disclosure about the respite carer or the day-to-day carer, we can't just, you know, next hand over say to them, oh, actually, by the way, did you do this? That's not okay, because it will also impact an investigation. And unfortunately, the last person to know in any investigation is the person that the allegations are made against. And that is because all of the material is gathered in, and we'll talk about this on Friday as well. All of the material is gathered in and analysed before it is presented to the alleged perpetrator. We also need to make sure we've got the right person as well. And often this can happen, particularly with children. They have distorted memories at times. They call different people different names, and it can be really tricky. So another key message about what we can't do, what we can't say, is about saying I won't tell anyone, because we have to tell people, because our job is to keep children safe. So if they tell you, I don't want you to tell anyone, then that's the beginning of another conversation. And it is the conversation about we really have to talk to somebody, because this is about keeping you safe. And, you know, if it was something historical, it may also be keeping other children safe as well. If nobody knows about this, then it's also about keeping other children safe, because that person might be around other children. So we can't not tell anyone. And unfortunately, the statistics from the Act for Kids actually tells us that only 1 in 3 adults will report when a child discloses, which is such a limited number. And we do have our worries, we have our concerns, because children being interviewed and becoming witnesses and all of the stress that goes with that, it's enormous. But we also have a responsibility to keep this child who's disclosing and any other child safe in our roles. Okay, I'm going to have a little pause there, and just to check on you all, I'm going to unmute you all and see if anybody's got any questions so far. Okay, changed my mind. So I won't unmute you all, but if you do want to unmute yourself to ask any questions at this point or pop anything into the chat panel, please do. And I can ask them just while we're in the middle of our content. Okay, it doesn't seem so. We'll move on then. Okay, so responding to the disclosure. The next step we need to do is write down what the child or young person has said, and in their own words, to the best of your memory. So the accuracy of this statement is important. This statement is then used to start an interview process. And if the child is unable to understand or know why they're being interviewed, then that statement may be used to assist in gathering the information. So writing down, so as once you have the information, you might be sitting there nodding and appearing in your most amazing composure, but reciting it over in your head to make sure that you don't forget exactly what the disclosure was, so you can run and write it down. We don't want to be partway through hearing what the child said and saying, oh, stop there, I've just got to get a pen and paper to write this down. You might just ruin the flow a little there. And the next thing is to tell your caseworker. So whether you're with an agency or whether you're with FACS, it's important to contact your caseworker and let your caseworker know what's going on, what they've told you. This information may form part of the story that they already know, and it may be new information. If it's new information, then it'll be about making a report to the helpline. If you need to make a report to the helpline, obviously that's the number there on the right-hand side. This is a discussion that you'd have with your caseworker, because as in your code of conduct and being part of that agency that you're providing care through, you'll have a discussion with essentially what would be equivalent in an employee situation as your line manager, which is the caseworker. You have a discussion with them about making the report. The types of information they're going to ask you at the helpline is who the person is. If that is just Uncle Pete or Uncle Jimmy, you just say Uncle Pete or Uncle Jimmy, and that you don't know who that is. If it's somebody that they've been really clear and you know exactly who they are and they've said their first and their last name, or that it's mummy's brother or something like that that gives you further identifying information, then you would say Uncle Pete, who is mummy's brother. And we want to be really clear that they're the words that the child used. We need to tell them what the actual allegation is and whatever the child told you. So that quote unquote, whatever the child told you. They will also ask if you know the when and the where, and those are the things required for the matter to go to JET. It doesn't matter, JCPR, the Joint Child Protection Unit. It doesn't matter if you don't have that bit of information, but they will ask you if you know when this happened or where the child was when this happened. Those questions of when and where are okay to ask, but I wouldn't ask them if you don't feel comfortable asking them at all, because it would have to be a very short question of when did this happen, where were you when this happened, and nothing extra. And you would have to write down that they were the two questions that you asked. We always need to make sure that we're keeping information confidential. So this is really important information for the child, and they would have developed a lot of trust in you to be able to give you this information. Or they're in a point where they're particularly worried and they need to give you this information purely to keep them safe. So it's a really critical time for the child and what they're experiencing. And then we need to make sure that the child is supported after the report is made. And when I say that, it's about that continued support and continuing ensuring they have the feeling that they're believed and that you'll stand by them and that they're not alone. When disclosures are made, when children disclose, they tend, their whole worlds change, particularly relationships with the alleged perpetrator, with their birth parents, with anyone that is related to that person. Relationships change really quickly, and often children aren't believed. And when they feel the pressure of not being believed or not feeling safe, then they can retract the disclosure. Retraction is common. However, retraction does not mean that it didn't happen. And in most cases, retraction is actually an indicator that they're not feeling safe after disclosing than it is an indicator of something not actually happening. Often people hear a retraction and then they like relax and it's like, oh, thank God that wasn't true. It actually leads the child into a position where they then feel trapped because there's sudden relief, everybody has taken the pressure off, but it's indicated to them that they're not actually safe to maintain the disclosure. Okay. So really important, nobody wants to hear this information, particularly if it comes out graphic, particularly if it's about sexual abuse. We don't want to hear it. It's not very nice. It's yucky. Lots of things that come out in that disclosure can trigger us ourselves, or if we've got our own experience of abuse or neglect, that hearing that could be really triggering. So we need to remember about our self-care. And remembering that self-care is not an emergency response plan to be activated at this particular time. It's an intentional way of living our life, our values, attitudes, and actions, and integrating them into our daily routines. So trying to be as zen as possible generally in our daily life, which is what we were talking about last week, is putting us in the best possible place to receive this information and not be in total meltdown mode. It's really important if you do have a child that's disclosed and this is triggering something personal for you, that you do get some help, that you do get to resolve this, what's happening for you as well, because this will change your state of being. We all behave differently when we're triggered. And I could probably talk about that for hours, but I won't. We behave differently when we're triggered. It activates certain parts of our own memory networks. It activates certain parts of our personalities, and we behave differently. If we have a child who has experienced abuse and is disclosing abuse, and it has triggered us in some way when we're hearing that, what they're actually reading is through their own story. So they're reading your reaction as something that they have done is bad. So we need to be really careful to look after ourselves to make sure that we're in the best possible place, that whatever reaction that we have does not impact the level of safety that the child has, and making sure that we've got our own support network, that we can get help if we need it to deal with what's actually triggering us, so we can respond in a calmer way when children do disclose. And often disclosure is inevitable at some point in time, hopefully not when these children are 40. Your response can have a great impact on the child or young person's ability to seek further help and recover from the trauma. And I think that's a really important quote in terms of thinking about what does this actually mean for the child. They're now going to be viewing themselves into what they're seeing in your response. It's going to impact their recovery process, and getting a response from you is actually what they need to be able to move into that recovery space. So there's kind of two options. They can go down the path of retraction and end up holding on to something, and that causing greater difficulty further down the road, or they can go onto a path of healing and feeling supported and encouraged to heal. So whether you believe or not, that's totally irrelevant. Children disclose because there's something, and the words that they use and what actually happened might be different, and that's okay. What it is the beginning of a recovery journey, and what they need from you is to just nod and smile and be okay and be there and help them on that journey and encourage them to seek help. So they may disclose at any time, and some of the factors that impact disclosure are the age of onset of the abuse, and it might be things like abuse started very early, and then now they're reaching the later years of primary school, and they're learning about personal development, and they're learning from Healthy Harold or whoever it may be these days that things are different and they're not what they thought they were, or that things that have happened to them are not okay. And whilst they didn't like what happened, they might not have known that actually what was happening to them was not okay. So that may spark a disclosure. Feelings of shame and pressure from family members. So if family members have a difficult response to what's happening, then it can impact what they're actually saying and whether they're going to hold on to their story. Feeling of fear of not being believed, fear of the perpetrator, and also fear of stigmatization or fear of negative reactions, consequences. We're just looking at a webinar for possibly next month or the month after on grooming and what happens in the grooming process and what grooming looks like and some grooming strategies. And it's through that process of grooming that the child builds these distorted views about themselves. And it may be through that process of grooming that's impacting on their ability to disclose as well. And, they may have received threats. If you tell somebody about this is going to happen, mommy will be hurt, or somebody will be hurt, or nobody will believe you, or you'll get taken away, or if the child's already in care, then they may believe that they were fundamentally taken away because somebody found out or somebody thinks that they told somebody. And so there's a whole lot of thought processes that are very negative and high in energy that sit around that disclosure process, and it's really about how does that all happen together that really indicates or sets the child up from recovery. And I guess because I teach quite frequently about disclosures and particularly sexual abuse and the impact on children and the frequency of sexual abuse, and the statistics at the moment are around 1 in 5 girls. So that's a lot of children, and when we think about the out-of-home care population, that's a fairly concentrated population of children that have already been abused. It doesn't usually happen on its own. There's usually other indicators as well, or other types of issues that have created that child to be more vulnerable So there's lots of personal beliefs for that child around them. And in a lot of cases, it's actually not the actual act that causes the damage. It's all of the thinking around that and the lack of ability to heal that actually has the biggest amount of damage on that child moving forward later in life. So when things happen, then it's actually the recovery process that's going to make the difference between a child building resilience or a child maintaining a level of vulnerability. I think it's important to say about now that disclosure is seldom straightforward, and it may be direct or it may be indirect. So sometimes an indirect disclosure might be about a child changing their behaviour. So making ambiguous statements or attempting to alert adults that they're being abused or having been abused, and lacking vocabulary. I think one of the case studies that I use when training in government, there's a very old 80s vignette, and it's about a girl Rachel and Uncle Andrew, and she says, is it okay for Uncle Andrew to do funny things? Well, funny is the word that Uncle Andrew uses, and Rachel doesn't have any other vocabulary to explain what's actually happening for her with any kind of level of comfort. But then we can interpret funny as in funny haha, funny silly, funny odd, but not necessarily funny wrong. So thinking about what is it that a child is saying, and something like, what do you mean by funny things, might be the way to move on the conversation rather than just leaving it as, oh yeah, it's totally fine. We're all good with funny hearts, lovely. And it's usually an alert to tell the adults that something else is happening. So sometimes older children might start engaging in risk-taking behaviours. They might try to disclose, and if that disclosure is not successful, then they may start with self-harming behaviour, suicidal behaviour, disordered eating, and it's all ways of having control over their body because they don't actually have the control in that disclosure process or feeling believed. Some children may just spontaneously disclose, and the timing of that disclosure can significantly influence the appropriate actions and response from the adult. And it is hard because, it's usually that spontaneous disclosure is in the midst of being busy or doing something. And any kind of little amounts of things, they may be just the things that you write down, those one-liner statements that you remain engaged and nod and pay attention. You may just note that information that you are listening because they may be the little tests leading up to something bigger when they're ready to come out with what's actually happening.
Danielle, would you ever suggest recording, like, surreptitiously or not, a conversation as it's happening?
Well, that's tricky, Alex, because to record something you need consent. So even though it's a child, yeah, it's a tricky one because we usually do get consent before recording. If you've got your phone in your pocket and you've got a child about to disclose, then yeah, I think if you're worried that you're not going to be able to write it all down, but also think about the impact though on trust, because if it's like a child, even at the age of 10, and then you actually have to tell them then that you recorded what they said.
Yeah.
So they're going to need to know at some point, and you can't stop them in the beginning and say, actually, before you say something to me, I'm worried I won't get to write it all down. So can you just wait until
Just wait while I get my
that?
phone.
Yeah, just wait for me to record that, and then we'll be in business. And then they're like, deer in
Yeah.
headlights going, oh my gosh, I'm not saying anything now.
Mm.
But then if you did it and then said to them afterwards, I actually recorded everything you said because what you told me is really important. Do you think you could get the trust back? Are they going to want to take that back and have that deleted? So a good example is a boy that I used to work with, and he was in emergency care, so staying in motel kind of environment. And he's probably, not only had he built good rapport with one of his workers, his motivation for disclosing was actually that he was worried that he was going to be placed and his perpetrator was going to have access to him in an alternative arrangement. So he disclosed, but given the frequency and the regularity of the abuse, this was all very, very raw for him and very, very big. Now, he'd already watched other family members go through the court process. He'd been groomed and told to not say anything and all of these things. He told his worker and he gave a very clear disclosure, but then he physically assaulted her afterwards. And he did that because it was about controlling his information. He really wanted to get it back and he couldn't. So it all came out in a big bundle, I guess, a big bundle of stress and worry because he was so worried about his ongoing safety that he would be placed back with a sibling that could cause harm, that it all came out in a big messy kind of bundle. But then it was like, oh, now it's out. I actually don't have any control over what's happening with this and I want it back. And with all of the triggered emotions and everything that was going on for him, he actually then started hitting her and hurting her because he wanted it back as well. So I think if you were to whip your phone out and press record, whilst it would be fantastic evidence and fantastic for any kind of prosecution, I would be really worried about
Could be
what
very
the
harmful.
impact. Yeah, and then just thinking about, because then you've got to recover from that. And if you're the one person that's their person in this universe that they feel safe with, is it a breach of safety and trust? A really good point. Did anybody else have anything else that they wanted to say about that while on that topic? If you do, you might just need to unmute yourself. Yeah, I think that there's lots of experiences of children where they do disclose, and we never feel like we have the best resources available at the time to us to actually cope with that. But I think this slide kind of keeps up all of our key messages, I guess, in terms of being alert to a disclosure could come, knowing that, you've got a child in care, something has happened, it's not been lovely, chances are it's going to come at some point. Keeping notes, being able to note any kind of mismatched behaviours, being able to note any kind of one-liners that come out, having regular conversations about being safe and recognising children's feelings and being able to label feelings. And we've been talking about that over the last couple of weeks in the webinars around just labelling what feelings are to help them build up a vocabulary of what are the feelings I'm having. Just being available to sit and hear, whether it's about the day or that eventually turns into the disclosure, and being able to report that. And definitely talking to your caseworker first if you've got something that needs to be said. Okay. So, any questions? I've definitely been talking at you for 50 minutes now. So if there's anything that you wanted to ask, or if you wanted to share any kind of experience that you might have had of receiving a disclosure or what's happened, please, obviously with confidentiality for your client.
Danielle, is there a legal obligation for carers to report it once it's been disclosed.
It's part of our code of conduct.
Yep.
Yeah. And, you know, as a carer, mandatory reporters anyway, because it's the field of practice. So, yeah, there is an obligation to report. It's a really tricky kind of balance and fine line because obviously you don't want to impact the relationship, and you might need some help with getting some advice on how do you have that conversation about that you have to report if that's a difficult conversation that you're going to have, or that you may find that the child's upset when you say, well, you actually have to talk to people about it. But it all comes down to being able to keep them safe.
Mm.
I think that kind of most compelling message, and you know, when I train about disclosures, is really about just not asking questions, just being present and just listening. And you know, the first bit might not be a reportable disclosure. The first bit might be something a little bit odd, but then there'll be the next bit and then the next bit. And if you've got all of those one-liners written down and then finally an actual disclosure comes out, then that's at the point where it's reported. But if little bits come out and you have that conversation with the caseworker and then add it all up, at the point where the full disclosure comes out, it's ready, it's time, and a child's ready to have that information heard. Okay. Anything else from anyone else before we wrap up for the day? So on Friday, we have our next webinar, and that one is about reportable conduct and managing reportable conduct if allegations are made about you. So looking forward to coming back together on Friday, and maybe not looking forward to reportable conduct, but it's an important topic. So
It's very important.
We'll get onto that one, and I'll stop the recording now, but I'll still be here if anybody has any kind of questions. All right button.